Now it's time to start the event. Good evening to all the participants, or good morning to you. It's good morning for some of you. Transition finance and climate-related shareholders' proposals. How should companies consider ESG engagement is the title of the webinar today. Thank you very much for participation. I'm Matsuki, representative of Proxy Watcher. First, some housekeeping announcement. We have simultaneous translation service available for Japanese and English in this webinar. At the bottom of the screen, you find the globe icon. Please select the language you would like. If you have any problems during the webinar, send me a chat. In the latter part of the event today, we are planning to have a Q&A session. The questions for the panelists will be answered as long as the time permits. Please post your questions in the Q&A box and indicate to whom you're asking the question. You are very welcome to post questions during the session. After the seminar, there will be a simple questionnaire sent to you. We will send you a link to the questionnaire if you could make an access to the link. Now I'd like to follow the slide to introduce to you the plan for today and the panel members. From New York, we have Mr. Sakon Kuramoto, attorney at law of Japan and the United States, Ms. Chie Mitsui, senior researcher, Nomura Research Institute, and Ms. Amegu Fukuzawa. Also, we have Mr. Nick Spooner. The four of them will speak in the meeting. And first of all, I'd like to very briefly introduce to you what shareholder proposals have been made in Japan, and then we ask Nick to tell us about the trend of the shareholder proposals in the world, and also Fukuzawa-san will tell us about the past proposals made for shareholder meetings. And from 6:20, we'll have panel discussions. The Mitsui-san and Kuramoto-sensei will join us in the meeting, and that's the plan. Let me very briefly, as an introduction, explain to you what took place in terms of shareholder proposals this year. The slide is only in English. Apologies. The market force submitted the shareholder proposals to the mega banks Mitsubishi Corporation, Toyota, Tokyo Electric, Chubu Electric, and to Toyota Motor Corporation. Shareholder proposals related to lobbying activities and climate change have been submitted. And those who submitted are Academic Pension, which is a Danish pension fund, Store Brand AM, and AGP AM, which is a Dutch institutional investor. Also, J-Power has received the shareholder proposals from Australian NGO CCR and two European institutional investors, Amundi and HSBC AM. Also, partly, some of the shareholders have made a campaign, and also from Kansai Electric Power, not NGO, no investors from Kyoto City and Osaka City. Shareholder proposals have been submitted. So the shareholders of various backgrounds are sending the proposals for shareholders concerning climate change. Now, Mr. Nick of Robeco will talk about trends in shareholder proposals around the world. The panel members will join in the panel discussion. So now Nick will be on the screen, the Robeco Climate Change Engagement Specialist.
Thanks very much, Ko. I think to get started, I thought I'd talk a little bit about sort of the pressures that investors are under, both in terms of managing risks within our portfolios, but also in terms of demonstrating the alignment of underlying companies within our portfolios. And that drives a lot of the stewardship activities that I'm going to be talking about today. In terms of what investors are looking for in terms of transition plans from companies, clearly greenhouse gas emissions targets are the most important, both over the short, medium, and long term, but also the supporting structures or architecture that we look for in terms of a company climate transition plan, such as the company's climate lobbying activities, climate governance, or their TCFD disclosures as well. The way in which companies and investors are doing this assessment is generally regionally agnostic. So we have a methodology internally that assesses the alignment of companies to the goals of the Paris Agreement, and that doesn't differentiate on a region by region basis. We are seeing more of that, particularly around the assessment of the level of ambition around greenhouse gas targets, giving more favor to emerging markets based off of the sort of historical responsibility towards climate change. But really, in terms of what this means for Japan, being a developed country, having more financial resources, is that the expectation from investors will be for a more accelerated decarbonization and transition to net zero than in some other countries in the Asia Pacific region as well. So this has grown in terms of the expectations around these targets for companies, and this translates into the shareholder proposals, is what I'm going to be talking about today. So what investors are really looking for in terms of shareholder proposals is clear disclosure around the company's transition plans. We have to think about the sort of segmentation of responsibility between companies and investors here. It's not the responsibility of investors to be setting the strategy of the company, but through these shareholder proposals, we can seek to drive the change, the real world impact that we're looking for in terms of companies having more advanced transition plans, and therefore sort of reducing risks for investors within their portfolios as well. So that's really the ambition of it. And we see sort of the responsibility of the board and the company to be setting the strategy and to be setting the decarbonization strategy of the company. And therefore, increasingly, we've seen a transition by investors to be voting against directors when we feel that these risks aren't being managed appropriately. We've seen some sort of historic numbers this year. ACCR led a really good campaign in Australia focused on Woodside Energy, and I think that's one of the highest where there's been a vote against a director campaign we've ever seen globally. But there's also been sort of a backlash against companies such as BP within Europe because of BP changing their targets and regressing their targets as well. So what we're seeing is an increasing maturity from the investor side in terms of the plurality of tools that investors are willing to use, both in terms of shareholder proposals, but also voting against directors, and the sophistication of the models being used to assess, identify, and then target companies with these engagement tactics.
Thank you so much, Nick, for introducing the investor expectations from companies. And actually, this year, because we are getting into the kind of the peak, season peak, in April and May in Western countries, and we are hearing that recently that the U.S. banks, resolutions to U.S. banks, they are actually, getting kind of low support. That's what my impression is. And last year we have such Russian invasions to Ukraine, and that's also kind of the reasons why the shareholder proposals got struggled to get the higher support. Could you share how you are seeing this kind of phenomenon?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you touched on one of the issues, and that's definitely sort of the energy markets right now and commodity prices, and then how investors are sort of interpreting that in terms of how they're voting as well. And unfortunately, we've seen a prioritization of energy security over decarbonization, and that's flowing into sort of the narrative around these shareholder proposals as well. We have seen these shareholder proposals filed for multiple years in the US, and they haven't been terribly successful. I think in terms of the things that I would sort of pull out of that in terms of how one should write a shareholder proposal or the level of success related to shareholder proposals is often one thing that investors struggle with is how prescriptive a shareholder proposal is. And if it's too prescriptive in terms of trying to dictate the strategy, then there can be reservations from the investment community in terms of whether they could support such a resolution. But I also think this whole phenomenon in terms of the resolutions at the US banks demonstrates something about the relationship between the investor community and the NGO community as well, in terms of the need for sort of great coordination. And we've seen good examples of that in the Asia Pacific region, but it doesn't seem to be the case within US, where the barriers towards filing resolutions are much lower. And so there are many more shareholder proposals that are filed, but we haven't seen sort of, because of the low success in previous years for these resolutions, we haven't seen that these NGOs that have been filing them have been taking on the feedback as to what the issues are with the resolutions in terms of changing, adapting, and hopefully progressing these resolutions over time. So I'd say that was a strategic challenge for those organizations.
Thank you so much, Nick. And my, last question in this part is about kind of pre-declarations kind of trend, because I've seen that investors, for example, key investors of Climate Action 100 Plus supports climate resolutions to Shell by Follow This. It's a Dutch NGO, and that resolution is co-filed by investors as well. And PGGM and MN Investments, they are actually key investors of the Climate Action 100 Plus. They are pre-declaring the support of this resolution. And in Japan, for example, what ACCR and other investors are saying to J-Power, actually Man Group, who is not in the shareholder proposal initiative this year, but last year they were in the initiative. They are also campaigning that they are kind of showing their intention to vote against one of the directors from J-Power. Do you think this is a case in Japan that we are expecting investors to say that we are supporting the resolution even before the AGM? What do you think?
Yeah, so again, I think this demonstrates the direction of travel in terms of how the investment community is thinking about their engagement tactics and being more public about some of the actions that they're taking, both in terms of support for resolutions, but also, as you say, voting against directors and the pre-declarations there as well, and gaining that momentum through through these actions in terms of the signal it sends to the broader investment community. So I see this as a growing phenomenon in terms of using this as a tool by the investment sector. I think it comes a little bit back to what I was saying earlier around the barriers to filing shareholder proposals. That can be quite administratively burdensome for the investment community. There was some stuff in the FT this morning around Norge's investment management, and they're filing resolutions for the first time. And they were saying sort of the constraints in terms of how many they could file per year, for example. And so these pre-declarations reduce that administrative burden and allow for companies to have a similar level of impact in terms of sending a signal to company and hoping to drive that change through expressing disappointment or concern about a company's transition plan without all of that work that goes into filing shareholder proposals.
Thank you so much, Nick, for wonderful insights. And we will bring you back in the panel discussion later. So I'll pass the torch to Ms. Meg Fukuzawa from Market Forces. Thank you so much, Nick. And I'll pin Meg-san. Thank you, Meg-san. So could you maybe a little bit introduce yourself before we get into the discussion?
Yeah, sure. I'm Meg Fukuzawa from Market Forces. I'm not sure if you have the slides.
Yes, I got the slides, so I will do the slides.
Yeah, and I'm just going to be kind of sharing the background on the 2023 climate-related shareholder proposals in Japan. Yeah, great. We can actually just move to the second slide. Thank you, Ko-san. Yeah, so I just wanted to give a brief background on the climate-related shareholder proposals lodged this year. So there's 6 companies here, the 3 Japanese mega banks, TEPCO and Chubu Electric Power, and Mitsubishi Corporation. So obviously all these companies are completely different companies, but there is a common theme here and also why we targeted these companies this year. So all of the companies, they have net zero commitments, but their current disclosure targets, transition plans are really insufficient for investors to conclude they have viable pathways to net zero by 2050. And this is particularly concerning given the company's involvement in fossil fuel related businesses. And for this year's resolutions, we're targeting companies across the entire value chain. Next slide, please. So again, there's six companies, but there are mainly two types of shareholder proposals this year. And the first type of shareholder proposal is to adopt and disclose a business plan or a transition plan with short-term and mid-term greenhouse gas emission reduction targets that are aligned with the goals of Paris, and this includes Scope 3 emission targets. And this kind of resolution has been lodged with Mitsubishi Corporation as well as the three mega banks. The second type of shareholder proposal is around the disclosure of assumptions around financials against a net zero scenario pathway. And from these have been lodged for Mitsubishi Corporation as well as Chubu Electric and TEPCO. And for Mitsubishi, it's around the disclosure of how the company evaluates the consistency of each new material capital expenditure with a net zero by 2050 scenario. And for TEPCO and Chubu, it's how it aligns its material strategic capital investments, of course, as investors of JIRA with a net zero by 2050 pathway. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to kind of go over some concrete positive changes we've seen from shareholder proposals, climate-related shareholder proposals in Japan over the past several years. So here are some of the examples. One is around the Sumitomo resolution, which was lodged in 2021, which we saw in the end, they withdrew from a risky project as well as changed their policy. So when the resolution was lodged in 2021, there was concerns with their coal power generation policy, which allowed Sumitomo Corporation to continue building coal power plants anywhere in the world. And the shareholder resolution asked for their business strategy to be aligned with the Paris Agreement. During the engagement around the shareholder policy, the shareholder resolution, their policy was updated to commit not to be involved in any new coal power plants. But they left a loophole to allow them to be involved in a coal power plant in Bangladesh called Mathabari 2 coal power plant, which had a lot of environmental and social problems as well as financial. And then after the shareholder proposal was lodged and the AGM was finished in 2022, that loophole was closed so that they were not going to be involved in Mathabari 2 coal power plant as well. Some examples with the, still same slide. Still same slide, so go back one, yeah. In terms of examples with the banks, so we've seen enhanced policies and target setting. The first kind of climate resolution on banks started in 2020 with Mizuho at the time. And then the mega banks had policies on coal power projects, but they didn't have any phase out plans. So with the Mizuho resolution in 2020, we saw the bank move forward by setting a phase out plan. Around the 2021 MUFG proposal, we saw that the bank ended up setting net zero emission reduction targets. And then in 2022, with the SMBC shareholder proposal, we saw them restricting support to expansions of existing coal mines or new coal mines and the development of related infrastructure. Next slide. So those are kind of concrete examples of positive changes that we've seen from the banks and other corporates, changes in policy, changes in target setting, but there's also other benefits from shareholder proposals as well, and that's enhancing communication between investors and companies. The shareholder proposals really give kind of a point of focus to discuss target setting, policy changes, and enhance disclosure. And through that discussion of those issues, there's a spread of understanding about the issues through the company management as well as the sector itself. And I think this is what we're going to hear about more in the panel discussion. Yep, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Meg-san. So from now, we are getting into the panel discussion, and we will bring back the panelists here.
From now, I would like to speak in English. Mitsui-san and Kuramoto-sensei are here with us for the panel discussions. Thank you very much. Before that, the questions, going into the question, self-introduction, please, Mitsui-san and Kuramoto-sensei. Thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Chie Mitsui, the senior researcher of the NRI. My research of ESG and disclosure, and also the challenges of the asset management, these are the research themes. And also that I have been promoting the advocacy that activities of the several investors groups. Thank you very much. Kuramoto-sensei, please. Thank you very much. And I'm attorney at law of Japan in New York, Kuramoto. Well, I'm a business, industrial lawyers, and also the business that human rights, and also the climate change of the environment and NGO. I'm supporting the industries and the persons, and also NGO. Thank you. Well, probably I don't have to show that the slides, but anyway, for the help. And this is the question to pose to Mitsui-san and Kuramoto-sensei. Why are the ESG shareholder proposals are important, and how should companies react to the ESG engagement from the investors and ESG-driven the shareholders? So this is a kind of general questions that I would like to pose this question to Mitsui and Mr. Kuramoto. Mitsui-san, your response, please, first. Thank you very much for your question. Yes, that for the ESG and the shareholder proposal was started from the 2020 in Japan. And so it was up to the very, very recently that many people consider that it's a very strange phenomena, especially that when in Japan, the shareholders, that in my generation, it's just something very dramatic. And from that, the shareholders meetings, and as well, there has been a lot of harassment that the shareholders' proposals means with the harassment to the directors. And so many people are not welcomed that the shareholders' proposals. But observing from the 2020, not only the shareholders' proposals, but with the emergence of the shareholders' proposals and the Japanese companies, ESG, especially the climate change, they are very seriously engaged into these issues, and these timing matched perfectly. And as for the Japanese companies as well, that in the early stage of the environmental changes or the climate changes, that the key investors are not that considered that this was the priority issues. They are not that interested in cybersecurity was a priority for them, and also the governance. And there are many challenges. And so that they considered that the climate change was not something to put the priority. But in the form of the shareholders' proposals, Meg-san said, yes, indeed. Well, all the shareholders and also the market have to be engaged for the discussions. And this is a root to this. And in this background, and this is the priority business issues, there have been the discussions welcome in this and shared among the community members. And this was the significance of the taking the form of the shareholder proposals. On the other hand, the company size, and still that I have been discussing with many of the business leaders, and how that the companies consider that the shareholders' proposals, some of that the company leaders are uneasy, nervous about the shareholders' proposals. They are nervous and they are uneasy to address the shareholders' proposals as a fair vehicles. They are worried to a certain degree. However, that into the future that the shareholder proposal is quite similar, but And some of the proposals have the discrepancies or diversity. But when you, as a company, receive the shareholders' proposals, and some of the companies with a leadership accept the shareholders' proposals, and their expectation is very high. So taking these opportunities that we would like to have the communication from the companies, opinions of them to be disclosed. And also, this is a wonderful forum for the respecting all opinions of the shareholders.
Maybe I spoke very long. No, not at all. Thank you very much. Mr. Kuramoto, the same question goes to you. For a company, for corporate or institutional investors, the company people, how should they consider ESG investment, and why is the shareholder proposal very important? From ESG shareholders' approach, how should the institutions, the companies respond? Now, I will need to do some publicity. Mr. Kuramoto is actually for the ESG shareholder activities. What is the significance of the Japanese corporation? The other day, Mr. Kuramoto and myself actually wrote an article. So if you're interested in this, please take a look. But Mr. Kuramoto, please start. Thank you very much. Mitsui-san already talked on the important points, so I'd like to keep my talk as short as possible. Some maybe overlap, but Matsuki-san's first question: what is the importance of a shareholder proposal? Now, already, as you work, as you live in the society, you may be aware that the time is changing now. And we, including us individuals, people's awareness are largely changing. Now, in this situation, for the company's perspective and mid to long-term perspective, they need to aim at the corporate growth over mid to long-term basis. Now, there are financial risks for the company, but that should not be the only focus for the company. Non-financial aspects, opportunities, as well as risks, the overall picture will need to be understood by companies so that mid to long-term growth of the company is to be pursued. As for the ESG, what is the significance of shareholder proposal? For a company, in order to achieve mid to long-term growth, broad perspective is necessary, and that must come from outside the company. The ESG-related proposals is received from shareholders, and they should listen to this very seriously, make judgments so that they can aim at developing the company on the mid to long-term basis. Therefore, shareholders' proposal is indeed the voice of shareholders, and it's very important that the companies listen very carefully and seriously about those voices. As I have said, for companies, being serious in listening to the voices is important, but the issues are not only on the part of the companies. As I work on the individual basis, I oftentimes think that the NGO shareholders, ESG shareholders, do have issues. Financial institutions do have issues also. So if there's time later on, I'd like to talk more about these. Thank you very much. Now, moving on to the second question, and this goes to Mitsui-san and Nick-san, to you. I would like to, I may not have to show you the slide, but how shareholder proposals on climate change help companies with transition plans, disclosing better transition plans, Japan and also in Europe. I'd like to focus on the climate change concerning this question. Now, this year, as for the lobbying activity, there was a shareholder proposal made, and the management's payment. This is the proposal to J-Power, which was initially proposed last year. But simply, there is a short-term target, a long-term target. Please disclose. That's a type of proposal. Now, the shareholder proposals on climate change is coming in various different types. Now, in the disclosure of transition plans, how effective would these proposals be? First, question goes to Mitsui-san. Well, there are different types of proposals being made, but as far as I see, always the transition plan disclosure is included in the proposal at all times. In Japan, the way the proposals are made in Japanese shareholders meetings has been limited. Since 3 years ago, we have discussed this issue a lot. We are different from the United States, and in Japan, there is a pattern for proposal. Then they must be linked to the changes in the amendment to the Articles of Incorporation, which means the corporate strategies would have to be written out, and that will have to be disclosed and linked. That's the frequent pattern we see. It comes as a set. As Matsuki-san said earlier, we are seeing different patterns of proposals made.
And how shall I say that for that transition plan and disclosure, I'm the specialist of the disclosures for the financial statistics of the financial performance. And disclosing per se should be very accurately done, that financials. And so that during the general shareholders meeting, that if you disclose, it's considered to be a little tricky, or that a little difficult to understand for the shareholders meeting. But as a contents per se, that when this is the opportunity of thinking about the article incorporation. And for that, the transition plan, that it is rather rare to consider that write the transition plan in the details of the article of incorporation. What are the mission? What are the risks? What are that explanation, the shareholders? That we really have to have a more detailed that explanation in the style of the article corporation. That the review of the article corporation. This is a good forum of that proposing the shareholders the proposals. And for the company, for the transition plan, and as one set of the article of the corporation, maybe amendment, and also that the shareholders' proposal, the climate change, or the disclosures on the stage of the company. This is a good opportunity of considering this. Of course, that once that you change the article of the incorporation, that we really have to consider the wordings. That once the wording is changed, it will be rather difficult to change again. But if there are the items that you can make commitment on the level of the article for incorporation. Thank you very much for amendment of the article for incorporation. That some of the institutional investors are hesitant to change of the article for incorporation.
What do you think? How could shareholder proposals on climate change help companies with transition plans, disclosing better transition plans? Maybe cases in Europe. What have you seen? And could you tell us about what you have seen in Europe?
Yeah, sure. I mean, a lot of good points have been made already. I think in terms of how I see the discussion evolving, a lot of this is sort of the transition in itself from setting net zero targets, setting greenhouse gas targets, to how do you substantiate those targets with capital expenditure, with clear disclosures around what you need to do as a company. Because it's very easy for a company to set a target for 2050 or somewhere thereabouts, but it's very difficult to then translate that into sort of actions that need to be taken in the short term, investments that need to be taken in the short term, strategic decisions that need to orient that business to reaching net zero by 2050, because this is going to be a massive shift within the economy. And so we see shareholder proposals as a means of dialogue between shareholders and companies, ones that sort of can be used to focus on specific issues as well as part of the transition plan as well. I spoke at the beginning around sort of the multiple issues that we look for in terms of transition plans, whether that be climate change lobbying, whether that be capital expenditure or other issues. And so the shareholder proposals can start to get at that and give companies advice or information or details of what investors are looking for, what is useful information in terms of investment decision making, in terms of supporting the evaluation of transition plans, such that transition plans could be credible and believable from the investor perspective in terms of reaching those greenhouse gas targets.
Thank you so much, Nick. And we would like to move on to the third question, which is actually to Meg-san and Kamoto-sensei. But just a reminder, we welcome for the questions to panelists later, because actually we are welcome to get the Q&A questions now, because we are having a Q&A session right after the next question. So please specify to whom you are asking question to, though. So
The third question is that if the ESG-related resolutions do not gain the majority support or take over the management of the companies, so that the gain majority is that very challenging, or 2/3 even, and net zero, so that change the action of the company to align with the frameworks like the net zero 2050. How should the investors and the companies interpret the resolution? So the same question to two people. Meg-san first.
Thank you very much. I think what I say will overlap with what Nick said. The companies and investors, this is a good engagement opportunities. By having shareholder proposal, the company policy may be disclosed, or target setting discussion may be deepened. Now, the investors' expectations may be better understood by the company through the discussion. Climate change. I have been involved in climate change-related activities, and investors say that was a good opportunity to engage. And some of the investors say that shareholder proposal itself presented the initial opportunity for engagement. Thank you very much. Kuramoto Sensei, how do you see this? Well, this is related to what I said earlier. The companies or institutional investors, how should they interpret? Well, there are ESG investors, and the transition to net zero would be to pursue social ideology, but that should not be the only purpose. The companies are being approached, and the investment for the institutional investors, the comprehensive value of the company might be enhanced. Positive perspective should be considered. Companies should listen carefully and have good dialogue. Corporate governance and other codes, substantial dialogue should be what should be aimed at. However, let me say that I oftentimes support Japanese companies. Now, ESG investors or NGO investors, of course, they try very hard. I do understand their efforts. But what I hear from company people is that they make shareholder proposal, but little opportunity for engagement, or how the proposal will link to mid to long-term profit for the company. Company people oftentimes want to hear that from ESG investors. So the issue for the ESG investors is that they should consider the Japanese context and consider how to change a Japanese company. Those perspectives would be necessary. So the regular, ordinary times develop relationship with Japanese companies in order to convince companies such a relationship building is important. Also, net zero is very important. This is a very important issue. Unless we change, achieving the goal would be jeopardized, I understand. But for companies, how their activities will lead to corporate profit it is indeed where they have their responsibility. So the proposals should take into perspectives for the profit generation for the company and explain that in detail. Such perspectives would be required of the ESG investors in the future in describing the proposal. Thank you very much indeed. Reduce the risk of the damage or the stranded assets. Those are being discussed at the climate change meetings. Thank you very much, Mr. Kuramoto. Now that we have had this question, we would like to move on to the Q&A part. Please send your questions to Q&A box. Specify to whom you're asking the question. We invite your questions. Actually, earlier there was one question that came in on the Q&A box. I would like to first make sure I understand who the question is directed to. Perhaps Kuramoto Sensei. Shareholder litigation is a tool to hold companies to be accountable. For the corporate companies to exert accountabilities, what would be the power of shareholder litigation?
Well, the Soji Home case is the specific case of the Singapore's securities market. So this kind of the specific case, I believe. So that it is a little digression from the shareholders' proposals. However, what is your view of litigation which took place in Singapore, actually? Yes, indeed. Yes, I have been a lot of chance of supporting of the companies from this vantage point. Litigation, lawsuit, for one, is for the tool for moving of the company, the society or nation. But from the general point of view, that the Japanese courts are very conservative, and politically and socially, and so that they hardly ruled that the radical rules. So if the society or the companies or the economy, if we would like to move them to one direction, well, the litigation sometimes move. Environmental litigation was really moved at the position of the companies or led the company, so that this is a good chance, a possibility. But having said that please consider that litigation is one tool, could be effective, but this is not the only tool that you can rely on. You should rely on that. You have to encourage that the company to engage, not only suing, and also that the Matsuki-san said, Jira, that the ghettos, that the car, that the chassis. But JX Singapore's the market force applied the pressure, and I think that it was 2-3 cases of bringing the complaint to the security market of the Singapore, and so that the company will be really have to be very mindful, quite mindful of this kind of complaints raised by ESG-oriented shareholders.
実はですね、actually, that question is to Nick, actually. It turns out that the person who asked the question wanted you to answer the question. So could you share the view of how shareholder litigations or complaint to the officials are, what do you think about this? Is it effective tool, as well as shareholder proposals to hold companies accountable?
はい、ほとんどの投資家責任がある人であるならば、ほとんどが、一つのツールと。
Sorry, I'm getting some feedback from the translation. One tool that can be used in terms of driving change, particularly as we see a stronger delineation between what companies are doing and what needs to be done in terms of meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, and particularly in terms of the changing regulatory structure, in terms of the increased duties for directors, in terms of managing ESG and climate-related risks as well. And so there's an increased regulatory burden, increased legal burden put on directors, and therefore sort of risks to them in terms of litigation, in terms of them not meeting their duties in terms of managing these risks. And we've seen this happen in cases within Europe, increasingly where sort of directors are being held to account directly, and I expect that to continue. I think the comments that I mentioned before around the time resources and time allocation that is required within an investor, within an asset manager, is true, and this extends to shareholder litigation as well, and the resources that are going to be required for entering into litigation cases are going to be even higher than filing shareholder proposals, and then therefore there are going to be reservations from investors in terms of the willingness to participate in that. But I think the coordination and collaboration between both the private sector and the NGO world may be supportive in terms of this tool being used more frequently as well. I think the other consideration is that my role is about talking to companies about how they could execute and implement their transition plans. And there's a lot of reservation from the companies around the concerns around greenwashing and overstating their ambitions as well. Certainly, we don't want companies to be putting out targets that they don't intend to meet. We don't want companies to be overinflating the sort of actions that they're taking. But on the other hand, we do want to be encouraging ambition, encouraging companies to be setting targets that drive innovation and drive radical change within these companies as well. So it's a fine balance in terms of this litigation risk between companies not doing enough versus not doing too much but saying too much and getting themselves in trouble for greenwashing.
Allow me to explain this in Japanese. And I think this question goes to Mitsui-san. Anti-ESG trend is seen spreading in the United States. What would be its impact in Japan? That's the question I have. What do you think, Mitsui-san? Mitsui-san or me? Who were you asking? Mitsui-san, could you please respond? Anti-ESG is spreading in the United States. What would be its impact in Japan? I know it's a broad question. Well, in Japan, if that's a question to Japanese operating companies in the United States, if they have customers in the United States, maybe they're affected, but otherwise there will be no direct impact in Japan. What you said was, if your question is about Japanese companies, as someone said earlier, or Matsuki-san, you said earlier, how would the American companies react to such a proposal? Maybe there is an impact in that sense. However, so far, anti-ESG leading to troubles to the operating companies. You have to say one thing to a customer and another thing to another customer. That's not happening. However, when it comes to the shareholder proposals in Japan, I don't think it's come to be big enough to be affecting Japanese companies, but rather this is a good opportunity. Let me talk about what Kuramoto-sensei said earlier about shareholder proposal. What is the significance of shareholder proposal? Now, whether it's climate change, anti-ESG, I don't think that's the point, because you're making proposal to a shareholder meeting, which means you're asking all the shareholders to vote, and what you're asking is the corporate value. The person who made the proposal considered this important. You want companies to be to react. I don't think anti-ESG would have anything to do with such a proposal. Now, looking at the proposals this year, some people may have started very recently, but corporate managements will need to make opportunities to give explanation to all shareholders. That's what the company should do too. because the voting takes place among all the shareholders, and if the decision is to be made on the equal footings, the discussion for the future will be important. So it's not just the company that needs to give explanation, but those who make proposals will need to make efforts so that more people will know what that is. Thank you very much. That was a very interesting comment. Now, simultaneously, we are receiving several questions. Now, this is a question to Fukuzawa-san, Kuramoto-sensei, and Nick-san as well. Oasis Management, the Hong Kong's activist fund, and the Japanese TPBR company, the shareholder proposals campaign is being carried out. Now, to Toyo Seikan in 2021, they submitted a proposal, and that was a climate change related shareholder proposal. Institutional, the investors, the ESGs, the environmental organization, do you think they may collaborate among each other in the future? Those are the traditional. The question about the environmental groups, institutional investors, and traditional activists, possibility of them collaborating in the future. Now, would it be possible for them to collaborate? And if Fukuzawa-san can answer within what you can. Yes, I think there is a possibility of collaboration in the future. Well, for the time being, Market Force or FA Japan, Kiko Network are the organizations working together with institutional investors in discussing shareholder proposals to deepen engagement with the companies. Topics and the topics of shareholder proposals are being used to expand engagement with the company, Market Force as well. That's what we have been doing. However, institutional investors, as they are involved in engagement, similar opportunities, targets, disclosure expectations, many other investors, institutional investors do share such expectations. So the possibility is that we can jointly submit the proposal.
倉本先生、このあたりいかがですか？これは結構伝統的なアクティビストさんとか、いろんな、NGO さんとか、機関投資家さんとか、かなりいろんな、アクターの方々株主提案とされてきましたけれども、機関投資家さんと NGO、機関投資家さんとか年金基金みたいな形の株主提案以外で、実際アクティビストファンドさんとの株主提案の連携なんか、これは日本で可能性あるというふうにお考えでしょうか？このあたりちょっと難しいと思うんですけれども、簡単に、はい、お伺いできればと思います。
オアシスマネジメントですか。フジテックへの、その広報っていうのは。
That was a very active news, and I have not involved in this. And so that worship management side, strategically, they are very well good at the asset management, and also that it was a very powerful setting point, or that the settling point. And in this sense, that the EC shareholders, ECG or Oasis is a good example of that joining hands with the activist fund that I have not involved in either of this, and therefore that I'm in neutral. I really don't know that if I'm if the supporting of the ESG, representative of ESG supporters, that I would like to join hands with the other members that have to make the many different routes for getting the majority. Even though that you cannot acquire the majority, that this is the threat, shall we say, threat to the Japanese companies, and therefore that the joining hands is effective. And if I'm the representative of the Japanese companies, and then how to disrupt the hands or the ties is my strategy. That pursuing that institutional investors and not to join with them, and activist fund and institutional investors sometimes that they could join hands. But even that the investors, institutional investors, are the ideal idea as well. So this is an area that we can join hands. I'm a lawyer, attorney at law, so that I support either case. But from the point of view of the ESG shareholders, joining hands with the other that stakeholders is a very, very effective way that, objectively saying, so that it's up to their will to join hands.
So this question goes to Nick as well. Do you think that maybe potential engine number one case, like activist funds, or maybe other investors are kind of partnering and asking companies to they are all together hold companies accountable as a partner, allies. Do you think this is maybe a potential move in Japan, maybe in several years? What do you think?
Sorry, was that to me?
Yes, this question is
okay.
also to you.
Okay. Yeah, sure. I think we haven't spoken much about collaborative engagement. We've seen the growth of that considerably under the Climate Action 100 initiative, which sits at around 68 trillion in assets under management. They're supporting that initiative and sort of working together on these shared goals around reducing emissions, getting in place the right climate governance and promoting TCFD disclosures. That's going into sort of the next phase of Climate Action 100 going out to 2030, and they've expanded some work on the demand side as well, which is an important area of focus. I just see in terms of the engine number one work, the role that investors could play in terms of electing directors. We've spoken a lot around directors who are not climate competent or not meeting their fiduciary duties in terms of managing climate related risks. But a big part of that is both getting rid of investors and then getting rid of directors and then bringing new directors on board that have greater competency, greater awareness of the implications of the energy transition as well, and sort of upskilling boards as well and bringing on new and fresh ideas into these boardrooms as well. So I certainly see that as sort of a route to driving change within these companies, and both in terms of filing shareholder proposals, but also in terms of electing board directors. There's a necessity for coordination between investors, both to gain consensus and to gain momentum and traction behind the support for these directors, but also in terms of the thresholds or requirements for filing a shareholder proposal or putting a new slate of directors up for election.
Thank you, Nick. Actually, one small question, additional question to you. Do you think that management of Japanese companies ever support shareholder proposals to the company itself?
Yeah, I suppose that in some way is the ideal goal, because that demonstrates the alignment between the proponents, whether that be investors or NGOs, and the company itself. And so what we're looking for, I guess that epitomizes the level of engagement or the depth of engagement between companies and shareholders. And that can be really constructive in terms of including something into the Articles of Association that will improve the long-term profitability of the company out to 2050 or to whenever the company tends to reach net zero. So that sort of demonstrates the level of constructiveness or alignment between the two parties to show that what is best for everyone over that time period. So I could see that happening for sure.
Thank you so much, Nick.
Well, we are running out of time. So next question is going to be the last question. And this is a question to all the panel members. Now, institutional investors and proxy advisor people, what dialogue do you expect? What type of dialogue would be ideal? The shareholder proposal concerning climate change to gain support, what is necessary? And I'd like to link this to the next question. The Japanese company, the Japanese government may have its policies and maybe there's nothing you can do about it. What is the best response? And the government policy and the corporate activities have a gap. It may be difficult to fill the gap. Some people will say that it may be too difficult to realize. What do you think is the question? You can answer either one of those questions. Mitsui-san, can you please be the first to respond? I'm sorry, you're always the first to have to answer. Well, the too difficult is the comment, and I doubt if that's too difficult or too harsh. The bar is too high. It says it may not be the case. It's not just climate change, but companies will have to deal with a lot of situations in terms of their business activities and the risk. That's what is happening now. To the corporate management, you request the adequate response. The shareholders request company managements to deal with the requirements. Now, in terms of communication, as I said earlier, the people who make the proposal may need to explain to other shareholders as well, not just to company, but the people who make proposals, other shareholders will need to understand. And right now, it's been difficult to achieve the understanding that the shareholder meetings, there are various stakeholders, not just the ESG shareholders. And of course, doing this alone would be difficult. You need support from the media. Maybe the media can report on those proposals more, and there should be more opportunities for discussion. Thank you very much. It tends to be that the shareholder proposals oftentimes rejected, and in April there are various reports that leading just about the proposal, not much more. So perhaps media can report the background more. Yes, that would be very important, because if you directly go for articles of incorporation change, you would expect rejection, because some people, some shareholders may not like the proposals to be made that way. Now this could lead to the agenda. Maybe you can involve professionals more in working on this, but the way you submit shareholder proposal may be discussed more in depth in the future, because if you submit for articles of incorporation change, it would be rejected. We would expect that. Maybe you can think of different ways of submitting shareholder proposal for better acceptance. We can discuss different ways. Next, I'd like to ask a question to Meg-san. Now, maybe the bar is too high for the shareholder proposal. That's the comment made. Now, this is a webinar for the institutional investors. You are attending this now. Explanation to the institutional investors. How do you explain? What dialogue do you have with the investors? Could you please elaborate on this point? Well, the specifics of the shareholder proposal. Well, bar is too high is what some companies tell us about the shareholder proposal. Well, within our engagement or within the shareholder proposal, we say it's scope 3 emission goal setting. That's what we require in shareholder proposal. But as we engage in dialogue with the companies, well, we don't say that that's a requirement until June this year. That's not what we do.
Well, so that the CO2 emissions, the regulations is difficult now, but by what time in a timeline that when that they disclose of that the emission amount. So our engagement in this way, not 100% expectation be imposed on the company right away. No, that is not the way that we propose. So as a background, that with engagement, we have been, well, putting forward our shareholders' proposals. Yes, before that, the shareholders' proposals that we have done, that the pre-works and homeworks, and that what we call that the rounding of the roots. So, Kuramoto-sensei, so what will be that the ideal way of addressing the institutional investors and also proposers, and how to introduce that the other stakeholders of your idea, please? Yes, in Japan, like Europe, that there isn't too much of the social awareness heightening, and also that the sense of urgency toward that the climate change is not that high, so that corporate leaders know about this, and so that we have to persuade them, and so that the ESG shareholders have to do a homework and do a hard work. And starting with the engage, we have been discussing, and the Meg-san said, so that we have to prepare that materials for the persuasion, and we have to persuade, and the company per se has start to changing. So this is the first round of rotating of this the wheel. And Oasis management is very intelligent, also preparing the materials and also proposing of the candidates of the directors. While looking at this, the other shareholders and the institutional investors are more compelled to agree. NGO that the shareholders, ESG shareholders can learn from their group, Oasis management, and so that they really have to do a lot before you persuade that the companies or the other shareholders, and this is what I call green tech, that we have to be carefully apply the green tech for the persuasion.
ありがとうございます。So lastly, I would like to ask Nick, objectively, what you see the kind of the ESG dialogue in Japan in general, because Mitsui-san just said that what ESG-minded shareholders to Japanese are asking to Japanese companies are not that strict, but at the same time, Mr. Kuramoto just raised that the ESG-minded shareholders need a kind of magic to kind of for more magic to improve the dialogue between with companies. So objectively from Europe, from the UK, what do you see? What do you think is the best ideal situation of the ESG dialogue through shareholder proposals? I think to wrap up this discussion, could you share your insights?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in my own personal experience, we've had really constructive conversations with companies in Japan. There seems to be a lot of interest in terms of learning from the experiences of Europe and the US, where maybe those discussions, both in terms of familiarity with shareholder proposals, but also in terms of the maturity of the discussions around these topics in particular. I would say sort of, whilst there's a degree of sort of recognition that this is easy for companies to do in terms of disclosure, what it means for the businesses in terms of these companies changing their strategy is much, much more complicated. And so it's about that collaboration, taking these learnings from regions of the world where maybe the technology is more developed, where maybe the policies are more developed, and thinking about that as a model through which Japanese companies could change as well. Those learnings are really, really important in terms of the impact that sort of carbon pricing or certain other policy tools might have, or in terms of how to overcome other policy hurdles in terms of executing a good transition plan as well. So we can really help in terms of translating this information or transferring this information from the European context into the Japanese context, and that can be very helpful too. But also in terms of the strategies that are used, both in terms of how investors are using shareholder proposals, but also the reaction of companies as well. You brought up the question around whether management will ever support a shareholder proposal. That's obviously something that we've seen within the US context and within the European context as well. And that gives us sort of confidence that this can be seen not as something that is adversarial necessarily, but aligned to all stakeholders in terms of the improvement or reduction of climate-related risks.
Thank you so much, Nick. Actually, sorry,
there are many questions. Unfortunately, the time is limited, so that we would like to conclude here.
Some of the questions that you have put your name, if you record your names to the address that you have sent to us, we'll try to respond to your questions as much as possible at a later date. The panel members, thank you very much for joining the panel discussion. I'm sorry we passed the scheduled time, but we were able to have a very good discussion related to the shareholder proposal. Now, I would like to briefly introduce to you about the questionnaire about the event. This is the questionnaire we would like you to respond to. We have just sent you the link to the chat box. It comes both in English and Japanese for you to choose. So we just had a webinar, and not just Proxy Watcher, but Insightia UK is a co-host of the webinar. I asked Rebecca of Insightia to close the meeting. And this is your QR code. Please read and answer the question. It only takes 2 to 3 minutes. So after the event is over, or as you listen to the closing remarks, you can fill them out. So, panel members, thank you very much. I'm giving the microphone to Rebecca now.
So it's all you, Rebecca. Yep.
Hello all, I'm Rebecca Sherratt, and I'm Head of Publications at Insightia, a diligent brand. I suspect some of you may be familiar with us. For those that aren't, we are a software as a service firm that provides a wealth of data solutions related to all things stewardship, corporate governance, and ESG. And that's ranging from investor voting information, shareholder activism data, to short selling and corporate ESG scores. So we've got our fingers in many pies. It's great to work with Proxy Watcher and all our great talented speakers on this event. As we wind to a close, I just wanted to give a few brief closing remarks, reflecting on the many valuable insights that have been shared during this webinar by all of our speakers. Clearly, ESG is becoming a really integral part of shareholder activism in Japan, and companies are going to be facing even more requests for enhanced sustainability reporting in the coming seasons. And this is actually reflected in our own Insightia data as well. In February, we published our 2023 Corporate Governance in Asia report, which explores the latest ESG trends throughout the region. Thank you, Ko. I've provided a QR code here for anyone who might want to download our report for free. It explores all the latest corporate governance trends in Asia, not just Japan, but also Korea, Singapore, China. Delves a lot into ESG, as well as short selling and shareholder activism more broadly. And according to our report, which tracks shareholder proposals and investor voting, in Japan, there were 12 environmental shareholder proposals subject to a vote throughout 2022, which is actually quadruple the number seen in 2021. And average support for these proposals increased to 17%, which is a massive increase compared to 5.6% average support just 2 years prior. So the data speaks for itself here in how ESG really has become such a key topic in Japan. And ESG is also gaining traction across Asia more broadly. 2022 was the first year in history that activists launched environmental campaigns in South Korea, and a record 12 environmental demands were made last year in the country. It's also worth noting that Hong Kong and Singapore also introduced mandatory ESG reporting for a selected group of public companies last year as well. So I think, as well as Japan, Asia more broadly is really embracing ESG a lot more. So it's a well-worth space worth watching. As I say, please do scan the QR code. You're welcome to email me if you have any questions. I will put my email in the chat. But that brings our webinar to a close. We hope you found this webinar very informative and useful. And thank you everyone for sending through their great questions. I'll also extend a big thank you on behalf of the audience for the great work on the part of our speakers here today. We hope to see you at the next event.
Thank you so much, Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And once again, I'd like to thank all the panel members, Mitsui-san, Kuramoto-sensei, Fukuzawa-san, Nick-san, all of you. Thank you very much for joining us from different time zones. Once again, thank you very much for your participation. And those of you who participated, I hope that you have better understanding about shareholder proposals. Thank you for joining, and I'll be looking forward to seeing you again in the next event. Once again, thank you. And this is the end of the webinar.
失礼いたします。ありがとうございます。ありがとうございます。
失礼します。
ありがとうございました。失礼します。
ありがとうございました。
失礼いたします。